Good evening, everyone. I'm Colin Bailey, the director of the Morgan Library Museum. Welcome to the first public lecture that is associated with our crop of exhibitions this season, which is a really uplifting season at the Morgan. We opened yesterday Frankenstein, 200 years of Frankenstein, and drawing in Tintoretto's Venice, which I hope you've seen in the Engelhard gallery. The museums will be open after the lecture, so if you have seen it, you'll want to see it again after hearing John's remarks. And we are delighted to be part of a group of museums celebrating the 500th birthday of Jacopo Tintoretto. The exhibition will be open until January the 6th, and it will then transfer to the National Gallery in Washington, who are our partners in this exhibition, where there will be a large retrospective devoted to Tintoretto's paintings and drawings, and we are pleased that this exhibition will have another life in Washington. I'll also mention that as from Monday, the Metropolitan Museum of Art has organized a dossier around Tintoretto and portraiture, and so this is an exciting opportunity to test some of the ideas that we see here in the exhibition at the Met and vice versa. As most of you know, Tintoretto is among the most distinctive artists of the Italian Renaissance. His works at the Scuola Grande in San Rocco are a Venetian counterpart to Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, some of the most expressive and moving paintings in Italy. And while Tintoretto is familiar, I think to many of us, most of us, as a painter, his drawings, and there are over 200 of them, his drawings have never been systematically studied, and we hope that, and I'm sure that this exhibition will be a revelation. There are many lenders and many supporters to the exhibition. I thank them, many staff members. It really was a labor of intense care and thoughtfulness. The person that I am really grateful to is John Marciari. And John, as you know, is the Charles W. Engelhard Curator and head of the Department of Drawings, where he joined the Morgan in 2014. And the first project that he brought with him and that he wanted to work on was this exhibition devoted to Tintoretto. He has done, among many other things that he's responsible for and that have happened during his time here, he's done systematic and careful research into the topic. He has identified the drawings that we should be looking at and that we have borrowed from museums as far afield as the Uffizi, the Louvre, the Albertina, and the British Museum. The title of his lecture, An Impetuous Genius, comes from the connoisseur, 18th century French connoisseur Pierre-Jean Mariette, who we devoted an exhibition to here a few years ago. For him, Tintoretto was an impetuous genius, the sort of artist who we would not expect to have made careful preparatory drawings. Yet, as John has noted, and as we will see, there are scores of drawings by Tintoretto that have survived. His exhibition and catalogue allow us to review and to revise the nature of Tintoretto's work as a draftsman, but also the role of drawing in Venice in the 16th century. I've heard him talk about his exhibition. He is enthusiastic, knowledgeable, and riveting, as he will be tonight. So let's welcome John to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you all for coming. As Colin explained, the title of my lecture is drawn from remarks that Mariette wrote in the catalog of the sale of the collection of Crozat. The impetuous genius of Tintoretto was such that he almost never made drawings for his paintings. He contented himself with modeling little figures, which he set up in a theater, which he then lit. When he was assured of the effect of the lighting and was content with the disposition of the groups, he went directly to painting. It is therefore astonishing, Mariette wrote, that there are in the collection of Monsieur Crozat so many drawings by this master. Now, as it turns out, I don't think there was a single genuine Tintoretto drawing among the 35 or 40 that were cataloged as such in the catalog. But the point still remains. And I like beginning with Mariette, not only because of the impetuous genius turn of phrase, but because he marks a sort of midpoint between Tintoretto's time and now, writing in the middle of the 18th century. Mariette was a very sophisticated critic, and he knew what had been said about Tintoretto by Vasari and Dolce and others in in Tintoretto's time, but he also, in a way, gives birth to a modern art history. And the same ideas that are expressed by Mariette continue to populate the scholarship today. But going back first to Vasari, who wrote of Tintoretto that he was il più terribile cervello, the most terrible, the most extraordinary brain that painting has ever produced. He surpassed the limits of extravagance, working at haphazard and without design, senza disegno, as if to prove that art is but a jest or a game. If he had only recognized how great an advantage he had from nature and had improved it by study, had he not dashed off his work by mere skill of hand, he would have been one of the greatest painters that Venice has ever had. Impetuous, he almost never made drawings. He worked without design, dashing his work off by mere facility of hand, rather than with forethought and proper intellectual consideration, like a good Florentine draftsman would have done. Now, these ideas, as I say, carry forward to today, and we don't expect Tintoretto to draw, and we're almost apologetic when taking stock of his drawings. So that, for example, one recent scholar on Tintoretto has written, quote, that the most famous drawing of Tintoretto's career is the one he never produced, which is an odd way of looking at him as a draftsman. In 1564, the leaders of the Scuola Grande di San Rocco, this confraternity hall that had been built between about 1515 and 1560, but that had remained undecorated, held a competition to decorate the ceiling of the Sala dell'Albergo, the boardroom in the confraternity hall up on the second floor. And they invited the four of the leading artists in Venice. Titian was not part of the competition, but they invited Tintoretto, Veronese, Giuseppe Porta Salviati, a Florentine who had moved to Venice, and Federico Zuccaro, who had recently come from Rome. They asked all four to make a drawing that would be reviewed by the board and which would then select the winner of the competition, giving the commission first for the ceiling and then ultimately for much of the painting in the scuola. Two of the drawings seem to survive, or at least there are drawings of the subject of the glory of San Rocco, St. Roch, by Giuseppe Porta on the left from the British Museum and by Veronese from the Gardner Museum at the right. Federico Zuccaro, I'm sorry, that's Federico Zuccaro. Giuseppe Porta's drawing doesn't survive, but he must have made one. But Tintoretto made no drawing. And instead, when the board was assembled to judge the winning competition, pulled a scrim of some sort away from the ceiling and revealed that he had put a finished painting in place. There it remains. I mean, this, you have to admit, is a brilliant, if irreverent, stroke. It showed him to be not only a good painter, but one who could work quickly and efficiently, who wasn't going to worry about the cost of materials, who wasn't going to bog down in all the details. But interestingly, the fact that he did this has been used to justify the fact that he was not a draftsman. Of course, he didn't make a drawing. He was a Venetian. He didn't make drawings, despite the fact that Veronese and other Venetian had done. And it fits into a much bigger pattern that we have of Venetian art in general. And here too, again, we return to and blame Vasari, who, in his Lives of the Artists, explained that Titian got off to a good start, learning the proper art of design in Giovanni Bellini's workshop. But he then discovered Giorgione and abandoned drawing, abandoned proper study, and more or less, Vasari goes on to say, and the rest of Venetian art goes off the rails. And it's on the basis of this that the famous disegno-colore dichotomy develops. Vasari distinguishes what he thinks is great about Florentine art, disegno, design, thought, intellect, planning, versus the superficial seductiveness of Venetian painterliness. And ironically, the Venetians sort of give away the ground on this argument. So Ludovico Dolce, writing his L'Aretino just after the first edition of Vasari's Lives, more or less agrees and says, well, yeah, Venetians, it doesn't matter about disegno. We do colore instead, essentially accepting that Venetians didn't draw and weren't concerned with disegno. Now, Dolce is a sort of interesting writer. but he's a literary dog's body, and we seem to think he speaks for all Venetian artists when he wrote this, and it has solidified into the prevailing opinion about Venetian draftsmanship. This sets the stage that 250 years later, 200 years later, Mariette still believed, and it's the basis of much of what is written about Venetian drawing today. And yet, from Tintoretto, this impulsive artist who worked without consideration or design, we have well over 100 surviving drawings, which is a significant corpus for a 16th century artist of any stamp. They're in a range of techniques. They're on different scales. They're of different types. They function differently as part of the artistic process. And moreover, the overwhelming majority of these are not casual sketches, but rather studies for figures in specific paintings, precisely the sort of preparatory study that this artist never made, if we listen to the writers. As in these two examples, both in the exhibition, made for figures in the making of the golden calf. We'll come back to these. And still, despite all of these drawings, when talking about Tintoretto's habits of artistic production, it's never the drawings that are of central focus. This exhibition is the first since 1956 to look at Tintoretto as a draftsman. The 1956 exhibition was really the Uffizi just putting a selection of drawings on the wall. This is the first lone exhibition really to pull together this body of material and to look at it afresh. But as I say, it's not the drawings that have been the focus. Instead, this is the most commonly quoted passage when we talk about Tintoretto's way of building up his paintings. A version of it already appeared in the Mariette quote with which I began. And this is from Carlo Ridolfi, who writes the first full biography of Tintoretto, although that's almost 40 years after Tintoretto himself died. But he talks about how Tintoretto made the little models of wax and clay, dressed them in bits of cloth, placed in little houses or vistas, these shadow box theaters, and then would hang models on strings from the rafters to study their foreshortenings. It's a nice idea, and it gets so much emphasis that the current exhibition at the Palazzo Ducale in Venice has even commissioned a little wax figure. Actually, it's not little at all. The diorama is about 4 feet wide. And they've hung a little dressed Redeemer doll from the rafters next to the Metz votive painting. And while I'm being slightly flip about this, I am skeptical, and I find it hard to believe that an artist who had, by the time he made the Forge of Vulcan, been drawing the nude human body for half a century, really required a little wax model in order to project figures in space. There's a vast body of drawings that speaks to the contrary. And so, ultimately, the exhibition upstairs and the accompanying catalog are intended to offer a new viewpoint on this material, talking not only about how drawings figured in Tintoretto's work and of emphasizing the importance of drawing to him, but also to look more broadly at Venetian art in the 16th century and to demonstrate how central drawing was to Venetian artistic practice, regardless of what Vasari and 500 years of parroting critics may have said. This is not to say that drawing works the way that it does in Florence or Rome, but rather to undermine the colore disegno dichotomy and to suggest instead that there is a distinctive Venetian disegno, hence the idea of a show about drawing in Tintoretto's Venice rather than merely Tintoretto's drawings alone. And as Colin mentioned, it's one of a series of exhibitions organized to celebrate the 500th birthday of the artist. And some of the same themes that are in this exhibition, Life Study, to which I'll turn shortly, are also explored, for example, in the exhibition at the Met. And I think we're going to see a new image of this artist and the way he worked for him. Now, on to the drawings and on to the show, which gets off to a roaring start with the astonishing, I think is the best word, drawing by Titian from the Fitzwilliam Museum. Now, if we talk about Venetian drawing, this is pretty much what comes to mind. It's in black and white chalk or charcoal and black and white chalk on blue paper. It's not a precise, carefully crafted, linear drawing, but rather something experimental and exploratory, something, I think, incredibly powerful. But if this drawing were by Leonardo or Raphael, we would talk about it as being a primo pensiero, a first thought in an intellectual process of design. Whereas as a Titian, it's almost always described as impressionistic and painterly and about pictorial values, as if there is no intellect behind the drawing. We, as critics, as scholars, too often fall into the Vasari trap. And it is a familiar Venetian way of drawing, these impressionistic black and white chalk on blue paper drawings, but it's one of many different ways that Venetians drew. And the first section of the exhibition is meant to demonstrate this. So yes, others follow this manner. So you have at the top, in the center, a drawing by Paris Bordone in imitation of Titian's chalk technique, although interestingly it copies a pen drawing by Titian. So there's a kind of fun awareness of media in that. But you also see other kinds of drawings, the brush drawings by Andrea Schiavone, or the colored chalks by Bassano, or the pen and wash sketches by Veronese, all being produced essentially simultaneously in Venice at the time. It is as rich and diverse a tradition of drawing as I think exists anywhere in Italy in a certain sense. And what's more is we get the idea that Tintoretto comes out of this rich and varied tradition and is aware of it and adopts different modes at different times. So as a young artist in the 1540s, he's associated with Schiavone. We know that they're working together. They may have collaborated on certain paintings, and there are a handful of things that are almost indistinguishable as to whether they're by one or the other artist. Even Vasari gets one of Tintoretto's altarpieces wrong and attributes it to Schiavone. And you see those brush drawings by Schiavone, two examples at the left from Washington and Princeton, and you get a sense of how Tintoretto in these drawings from the mid-40s is doing something essentially similar, drawing a bit with chalk, a bit with pen, using a lot of brush and wash. They are painterly, impressionistic drawings, if you want to call them that. And this great study of Venus and Vulcan from Berlin is as good a place as any to start with a more serious discussion of Tintoretto as a draftsman. It's a study for the painting in Munich, and there's a great story going on in this scene where Vulcan has discovered his wife Venus in bed with Mars, who, at least in the painting, is hiding under the bed. You see his head poking out there. The dog's going to give the game away while Cupid sleeps away off in the corner. Now, in the drawing, we only have the two principal characters of Venus and Vulcan. Now, this is one of those drawings that is always, I don't know that there's a single discussion in print that doesn't refer back to Ridolfi and the little shadow box theaters. And yet, when we look at it, I don't know that that really makes sense, despite even the attempt of one scholar to make a computer model to prove that this was done with a shadow box. Because if it's really made with such a theater, how would these wax figures actually stood up or sat in space? And if he's using it to understand space and perspective, why is the perspective so far off? And why is the reflection in the mirror in the back incorrect? If he's actually using a theater to map things directly onto the canvas, first of all, he doesn't need to make a drawing, because the argument says that he made the theater so that he could go directly to painting. And then it just doesn't read as something created from such a setup. Yet it's hard to say because it's one of only a handful of compositional drawings by Tintoretto that survive. So although there are many studies by him, they're almost all figure drawings, usually a single figure. And we think that the drawings must have been kept in the workshop by type. All the compositional drawings together, the figure drawings, actually there's reference to the bundle of male figure drawings and the bundle of female figure drawings, and somewhere along the way, the bundle of compositional drawings got lost. Interestingly, though, we know that the bundle of compositional drawings by his son, Domenico, stayed together because it is still together as a group in the British Museum, or at least much of it still is, having been acquired in the 17th century. So you can see how one group survives and another just gets lost. And so we don't have comparable evidence to consider the bigger questions about this compositional drawing. It's a one-of-a-kind, almost. Anyway, even if Tintoretto used a little theater for this, although I'd like to attribute more skill to him than that. Even if this is made with a diorama, would he even possibly have been able to use one to create a painting like The Great Miracle of the Slave, done 2 or 3 years later? This is an extraordinary, monumental, complex composition, far beyond what I think could be easily arranged in a diorama. Now, surprisingly, not a single drawing can be connected to this painting. Not a single direct figure drawing survives for what was the most important commission that he had really for the first 50 years of his life. It's the painting that makes Tintoretto's career in a certain sense. But I think we can see other drawings that are like those that he would have made for this, such as this study, which is in the exhibition from the National Gallery of Art in Washington, of a man posing, a man in ordinary clothes, in 16th century clothes, using a posing staff to hold the pose. And he is, I'm not saying he's a study for the man in blue, but if you spin him in space, it's awfully close to that kind of life study that would have been used. Likewise, we have drawings like this one from decades later, made in a different context, but there must have been a similar sort of life study made for the nude that appears, the nude slave, in the, foreshortened at an angle in the foreground of the painting. This painting, I think, is as much about life study as it is about anything, and I think to prove that point, we can look at some of the other works done right around the same time or in the years just following, such as this one, which is in the exhibition. Christ Mocked, shown with the drawing from the Louvre that is the poster boy, if you will, for our exhibition. And this seems, in a way, patently a life study, patently a study of someone sitting in the studio with his arm propped up on the side of the couch, drawn from life, worked up, and then plugged into the painting. Although even as he's drawn, he's somehow given the Tintoretto treatment. He's stretched out. He's made more expressive, more emotional than the posing model is likely to have been himself. But this is a pattern we see. The St. George and the Dragon in London, done 1552-53, for which there is a nude study, again in the Louvre, for the body of the dragon's victim in the background. Or, again, from 1549-50, the St. Augustine healing the lame, now in the museum in Vicenza, which seems almost like a painting about life drawing. It's full of posed nude models. This is the sort of thing which, if it were by a Florentine artist, we'd talk about how he was deliberately importing posed life studies into the painting to make a programmatic point. And again, none of these drawings are not for that painting, but one can imagine many others like it being used. And there is this very damaged study in the Uffizi, which normally is mounted upright, but when you turn it 90 degrees onto its side, is awfully close to this body in the background. And if he's making a drawing like that for someone in the background, he must have made other studies for the foreground figures, very similar in type, even though they don't survive. 200 drawings may be a lot for one artist, but it can only be a fraction of what he made over a career that lasts 60 or 70 years. And then returning to these two studies, which I showed earlier for the making of the golden calf. Now this is for one of the pair of big paintings made for his own parish church, the Madonna dell'Orto, which at a slightly difficult moment in his career, where commissions aren't assured, Tintoretto offers to paint these two enormous paintings, more or less for free, for the cost of materials alone. And he paints a Last Judgment, and then this, the making of the golden calf. So we have this sculptor here with his dividers in his hand, pointing to a calf that's gray, that is to say, made of clay, And all around, people are collecting gold, presumably to be melted down and cast into the golden calf. So it's a sort of pre-history of the story. And down here in the foreground, and the painting is on the left wall of the choir, so these are the two figures closest to the congregation in the church, you have this group of one woman removing the earring of the other. And yet, the two drawings have nothing particularly feminine about them at all. Instead, they're drawings of nude males, presumably, again, based on the study of men posing, or youths posing in the studio, then somehow transposed into typical Tintoretto figures. But again, this idea of a requirement of understanding these figures as nudes underneath their clothes before painting them in the way he does, flies in the face of everything we've ever been told about Tintoretto as a draftsman. And they're not isolated examples. I could go through lots of them, but I'll just use one more. This standing figure from the Morgan's collection, worked up in chalk, then gone over with a bit of oil paint, which is for the figure of Prudence, which is in the choir in the same church, in the Madonna Doll. Again, understanding as a nude male what ultimately becomes a clothed female figure. And again, the idea of working and reworking and considering carefully, because this drawing starts as chalk, is worked up in paint, then he holds it up to the light and traces it through so he can consider it in reverse, something he does again and again and again. There are I don't know, 30 drawings that are traced through like this. We have 2 in the exhibition mounted on double-sided stands. This is a kind of standard trick in Central Italian draftsmanship. You know, we think of someone like Parmigianino doing this kind of thing all the time. But it again speaks to a careful process of consideration and preparation for all of these paintings. And he experiments in how he does this. Some drawings are nude, and then there's a second drawing with drapery. Other times, he just keeps working one piece of paper. I love this drawing from the Uffizi, where you seem to have, I think, 4 different positions for the head inclined. You see the sort of, nose is moving through space with 2 different arms, done first in black chalk, refined with this sharp, I think, piece of chalk dipped in oil or charcoal, and then a bit of white heightening that actually corresponds to drapery that covers that figure in the painting. Or in this case, he uses chalk and then grabs a pen and with brown ink refines the contours. Interestingly, in the old catalog of Tintoretto's drawings, neither of these is accepted, partly because this is the only example of a drawing in which he used pen, and for that scholar that was too much of an anomaly. For me, instead, there's a consistent pattern. Grab a brush and trace it in oil, dip your chalk in a bit of oil and go over the contours that way. Or if you happen to have a pen on the table that day, you use it for this drawing. Again, there's a constant experimentation and evolution in his drawings. And that same sense of experimentation comes out brilliantly in this painting, acquired a few years ago by the Yale Art Gallery. It's clearly some sort of studio experiment. First of all, Tintoretto never paints on panel. This is a piece of wood, but it's not the poplar that you would usually use for a painting. It's not a prepared panel. Instead, it's hammered together. There's a board here and a series of boards and then another one at the end. It's larch wood, a hardwood that no one has ever used for a painting. It's a cabinet door or the bottom of a drawer or something like that, which hasn't even been planed smooth. These are gouges in the wood, and it's not gessoed or prepared for painting. And we look at it and you can see, he's drawing in paint and then he works up this one head to a high degree of finish. It's unfinished, but one gets a sense this maybe was never meant to be a completed painting. There are weird relationships between the figures. There are weird bits of scale. There are multiple layers of drawing. You feel like you can see through and see some darker drawing in here. With technical study, though, you look at this with an infrared camera and you see something even more extraordinary. This sketch that I don't think you could ever anticipate, even from the unfinished painting seen in natural light. It's maybe easier to compare them side by side, where the position and scale of John the Baptist, his head is here in the painting, and then there in the sketch. And the position of Christ is completely different. There's some bit of architecture or something here in the background. So there's this layering of media. There's this first sketch in black, then there's a sketch in a kind of dark brown, then there's the drawing in white paint, and this sort of reddish, mauvish color that often resulted from him mixing the remainder of the paint on his palette together and using that. We know it's composed of all sorts of pigments. And all this is very visible in this painting because it's unfinished and experimental. But the technical study being done on all of his paintings, many were restored for the exhibition in Venice, reveals that this way of working, layer upon layer, drawing in paint and then working up to a high degree of finish, is more common than we would ever expect. There'll be a paper about this in our symposium on November 1st. Tintoretto evolves, though. He goes from these kinds of drawings in the 60s to something simpler, more schematic, more quickly drawn in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s before his death. He gets to what we call the sacco di noce style, the bag of nuts style, with musculature that has come a long, long way from any sort of life study and takes on a life of its own. The figures are more schematic. And you think, well, why do this? I mean, part of it is constant experimentation, but I think it's easily explained when you think about how much work the guy had by this point in his career. By the middle of the 1570s, first Titian dies in 1576 from the plague, leaving the way open for commissions not just in Venice, but all of the aristocratic courts around. And Tintoretto quickly gets work for Mantua for the first time. And then there are the two great fires at the Palazzo Ducale, which requires the repainting of miles of rooms through the palace, atop which Tintoretto had by that point won the right to do all of the decoration for the entire Scuola di San Rocco, upstairs, downstairs, boardroom, main hall, etc., by himself, for himself. He needed a huge, vast workshop to accomplish even a fraction of this. And I think these schematic drawings are not only a matter of time. Who's got time to sit and make a careful life drawing when you've got 38 figures to paint today? But I think also with the big workshop, there are a more easily followed map for the students to follow. Take something and put one of these up there in the painting. And we do get the sense that there are many paintings executed by one or another not always terribly good assistant, but for which there are drawings by the master himself. He's still orchestrating the endeavors in the studio. He's not in retirement at all, but he's not painting the big pictures himself. And part of the exhibition upstairs is about the training of assistants and those who follow. His children, including Domenico, and I think this is a nice juxtaposition of a Jacopo and a Domenico. There are a few instances of that in the exhibition. Palma Giovane, who comes to Venice from a different training, but then is immediately associated with the Tintoretto studio, and there are several ways that we can prove that. And then even this mysterious draftsman, who's there in Venice, somewhere in the ambient of Tintoretto and Palma Giovane, and who is it's recently been suggested, might be the young El Greco in Italy. These, though, are discussions for another time, topics of their own. What I want to finish instead with are the other body of drawings by Tintoretto, not the preparatory studies, but the big group of studies after sculpture. There are many copies after Michelangelo, especially after the group of Samson and the Philistines. More than 60 drawings like this one are known, the vast majority of which are drawn front and back. There are drawings after the Medici tombs. We have a couple of examples upstairs. And these two call to mind literary devices. Ridolfi tells us that Tintoretto wrote on the wall of his studio the design of Michelangelo and the colori of Tiziano, which sounds nice, a Venetian copying Michelangelo. Although it's a turn of phrase that had appeared in Palopino's dialogue back in the 1540s. Doesn't mean that Tintoretto didn't adopt it, but it's a sort of literary device and may not really have been the summary of what Tintoretto is all about. The drawings are not only after Michelangelo. There are examples drawn after Sansovino modelli, and there are nearly 50 sheets after the so-called Grimani Vitellius, this ancient bust unearthed in Rome and sent by Cardinal Grimani back to Venice, which remains there in the Palazzo, now in the Carrara Museum, in the Archaeological Museum. Now, the traditional account of all these sculpture drawings, be they after Michelangelo or Sansovino or antiquity, is that they're the work of a young Tintoretto, an artist who didn't really come out of any one workshop, training himself by looking at everything. It's a kind of eclectic mode often seen in 16th century art. And maybe he did study these things as a young artist. But in the course of the research for this exhibition, I think there's a different story that came out. So in the case of the Grimani Vitellius, there are at the British Museum 5 double-sided sheets. Here they are set up in the study room. So 10 drawings in all of this bust attributed to Tintoretto. And there are different views. There are some details of the drawings. Some are from the left, some are from the right, some are slightly further down below, some are higher. The sheets can vary widely in quality. There could be a really good drawing on one side, and then you turn the sheet over, and it could be the worst of draftsman on the back. There is at least one left-handed draftsman in the set, or at least someone who shades from upper left to lower right the way a left-handed artist would. They're patently by a number of different artists. This is not hard to imagine. Fialetti shows us this slightly romanticized view of an artist's studio, but you can imagine a cast of the bust set up and young students sitting around it all making their drawings. But there are other problems when you look at these, because sometimes, we know the bust had 2 ears, it still exists. Sometimes it's not clear what the draftsman, is this hair or an ear or what's going on here? He's lost sight of the form, which he wouldn't do if he's copying the bust, but he would do if he's copying a drawing. Even more telling are the highlights. Almost all of these drawings have 1, 2, 3, 4 dots of white up the nose, a little splodge over the right eye, and a little dash on the chin. Now, if you're sitting on the left side of the bust and the light's wherever it is, and someone else is drawing from the right side, the highlights shouldn't be in the same place. They should shift according to your position and relative to the light. So what do you make of all this, or what did I make of all this? It seems that the only logical explanation is that students are drawing this bust from different angles, but with one of Tintoretto, or 2 of Tintoretto's own drawings stuck to the wall with it. So they're, in a way, learning to draw by studying a form in the manner of the master and following his tips for how to draw. And this is true not only for the Grimani Vitellius, but also for the Samson drawings. So here you have one side of a sheet in the Courtauld, and then front and back of the sheet from Harvard that's upstairs in the exhibition. And it's just too coincidental that these drawings would have exactly the same mise en page unless they're copying something else. And again, those dots of white highlighting, they're a little oxidized here, so maybe easier to read, across the shoulder. You see them there, you see them there, you see them there. And then interestingly, there's even a brush drawing by Palma Giovani in the exhibition which has the same dots of highlighting which Palma didn't usually use. So this idea of copying Tintoretto's own interpretation of the sculpture as a way of learning. Now, what's all this tell us? One is these drawings are not by Tintoretto, or only rarely so. And they're almost certainly not the young Tintoretto, but rather the established master who's using them to train that vast workshop in the 70s and 80s. The dating, the attribution, the function of these is entirely different. They also, though, point to the centrality of drawing to artistic education in Venice, that this painter had his students making drawings. Moreover, if we compare them to the drawings from the 70s, the old bag of nuts study from the Albertina, for example, I think we begin to understand that these schematic forms of muscles are meant to remind the students to think about volumes, think about figures in space, think about making figures that are expressive and emotive, which was the lesson ultimately learned from drawing the Michelangelo cast. It's not about copying Michelangelo per se so much as learning from that example of making expressive bodies. And then finally, these drawings, I think, emphasize the fact that all of the preparatory drawings, the schematic, stylized, simple preparatory drawings, were functional. They were not exercises in aesthetics. They're never carried forward to a degree of high finish just for the sake of beauty alone. And so to end with one last literary reference, again from Ridolfi, with two of the more schematic late drawings from the exhibition illustrating it. Tintoretto was visited by some Flemish youths who had come to Venice after being in Rome. And they brought with them some drawings executed with extreme care in red chalk. And Tintoretto asked them, well, how much time did you spend on these drawings? And they said, some said 10 days, some said 15. Truly, Tintoretto said, and you can imagine him smirking as he says this, you could not have taken less. And then he dipped his brush in black and made, with just a few strokes, a figure, touching it boldly with white highlights. And he turned to them and said, we poor Venetians do not know how to draw except this way. Tintoretto was well aware of what drawing was in central Italy and what it could be and how it might work, but he was not interested. He drew constantly for his entire career, and he painted in long, drawn lines. His art is absolutely grounded in the process of disegno, but it's a distinct Venetian disegno that we see through the work of the entire century. Thank you.